All right, take it away, Jason.
Okay, thanks everybody. Hi from the cold, wet, cloudy UK. Yeah, so we just wanted to bring a quick update on the completion status of the Mojaloop on Azure project and talk a little bit about next steps. So we're going to kind of run through and look at the journey we've been through, the degree of completion against our initial kind of thinking, baseline architecture, some of the kind of meaning of why we did this and kind of the capabilities that it's going to give us in the longer term. And then really a look at how do we take this forward to a second phase project and the benefits that's going to bring. So, I mean, just for the sake of recapping for everybody, that Microsoft decided to sponsor an internally funded engineering activity to see how we could leverage a lot of the kind of native capabilities in Azure and our hybrid solutions to drive some additional benefit into the Mojaloop concept and project. So we kicked off the project with really 3 solution goals. Number one, we wanted to look at operational and cost optimization. So how do we take the open source solution? How can we bring in some more Azure native services so that the kind of ease of management, ease of deployment, the sort of technology footprint that needs to be operationally managed by the ops team running the kit, how do we drive that down quite considerably? And how do we automate those deployments in a way that is customizable? So this isn't kind of a one-click deploy. This is the view of a set of templates that would work with and in conjunction with the work that your IAC team is doing, but leverage the Azure native PaaS services. The PaaS service piece is really quite important here. The degree of scalability that we have, the options for very kind of low-grade PaaS services that are heavily cost optimized at low end, but will scale up to kind of enterprise grade, high throughput, high performance, without changing the characteristics or the management and operations of those services, was driving us towards PaaS being a really great option here. So database as a service, Azure Kubernetes services, so you don't need to think about the whole management of your Kubernetes control plane. So number one, can we get this running as natively as possible on Azure? The second thing is, like, how do we make this really easy to adopt? And as part of the Azure cloud, we have this concept of the Azure Marketplace, and the Azure Marketplace is there to allow us to have pre-packaged, pre-configured, easy to deploy, and as far as possible, one-click deployments of an instance of a service into the subscription on Azure owned by an adopter. That could be developer, it could be a regulator, anybody who's wanting to kind of kick the tires and look at an operating version of the platform. And initially the scope for that was kind of early adoption dev test, not kind of production scale, because you'd likely take a slightly different approach to that. Although there is no reason why you couldn't have different production grades in the Azure Marketplace and have it auto deployed to a particular transactional throughput. And the third one, and I think this is really interesting, just reflecting back the previous presentation. How can we leverage the hybrid capabilities that we've got in Azure, and really using Azure Stack? So if, in case people aren't familiar with Azure Stack, we have kind of 2 grades of it that are applicable here. The goal is that you can run an on-prem system that looks, feels, and largely behaves in the same way, certainly operationally, as a public cloud solution. So you should have a very small delta between the public cloud deployment processes. You want a single operational management plane that covers security, monitoring, logging, alerting. You should be able to leverage the same continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines. It should look and feel like you're in the cloud, but you are very clearly on-prem and kind of complying with the requirements that you've got in from a regulatory data residency kind of perspective. So our goal was to get Mojaloop running on Azure Stack. The long-term benefits would for those deployments in regulated markets are huge. So Azure Stack in our kind of go forward configuration, which is Azure Stack HCI, it runs on commodity hardware. And we have a portfolio of commodity hardware suppliers. We've got Dell, HP, a number of others in our kind of catalog. And these are, very thin, cheap racks at the low end, running anything up to full-blown high-grade 16-node clusters if you want to run really, really high throughput. What's really interesting about that model is that the suppliers of the hardware, the Dells and the HPs, they now ship that commodity hardware with Azure Stack HCI pre-installed, and they integrate both firmware upgrades and the operating system upgrades with our Azure management plane. So whenever we ship an update to the operating system that's deployed onto Azure Stack HCI, the hardware vendors can package firmware updates, and you get a really, really simplistic management piece. And an interesting development over the past kind of 12, 18 months is now that those hardware vendors, both Dell and HP, are offering an OpEx model. So you don't even have to buy the hardware, you can just rent it. So you're switching the entire model for on-prem from a procurement exercise, deployment of operating system, and then the stack, to having a pre-configured cloud-compatible operating system, firmware updates in a full OpEx model. So you're renting the hardware, you're renting and paying in an OpEx model for the software stack and operating system, and the charging model obviously for the Azure components that get layered on top of that, again, are in this kind of consumption-based model. So the goal here was to really, really drive the adoptability at a low management, low deployment and complexity overhead in these kinds of markets. So that's seen as a real win. And as we stand at the moment, our geographic coverage for Azure Stack HCI, depending where you buy the kit, is pretty much every country in Africa. So coverage is good, and we're trying to drive those down. Now, outside of the engineering project, what we also had a plan to do right at the beginning was kind of a joint go-to-market or let's say a roadshow or promotional activity where our Africa Transformation Office, which is a new organization, we have to really drive positive outcomes with a very Africa-centric viewpoint. We're kind of going to go together with the foundation and go and talk. We'll do some media work, we'll do some road shows, and we're also driving Mojaloop discussions with some of our commercial and public sector customers. So that's kind of where we wanted to get to with this, and some of the rationale. We thought that we'd have about 6 months of engineering, but we wanted to go through this process of solution architecture. We engaged the foundation technical team. So we had Warren and Michael and Greg and the team provide some kind of initial guidance. We then kind of scoped up what we thought we could achieve in the timescales and budget. And then our goal was to run Azure Native, Azure Stack, and Azure Marketplace within roughly a 6-month timeline. At which point we're going to do two things. One, all of these assets that we've built in how to build, run, operate Mojaloop on Azure and Azure Stack, have a transition to hand over those assets to the foundation, and then drive this kind of marketing, for want of a better word, marketing campaign. So we took about 2.5 months longer than we thought. There was some kind of tidy up activities on there, but we've pretty much achieved all of the goals that we originally wanted to do, with some technical caveats, I'll say. So where did we get to in terms of completion status? So we managed to get a fully tested and validated model of Mojaloop running on Azure native in public cloud. There's significant changes. There are quite a few things here, but it's running in Azure Kubernetes services with its fully managed. Obviously, it's a PaaS service, so it's fully managed Kubernetes with auto and predictive scaling. So that kind of scale up, scale down requirement in terms of peak loading, scale up as time progresses is kind of built into that stack. We swapped out API management and security to leverage our API manager service, and there are a few enhancements that we feel we've brought in by doing that, especially around kind of certificates and certificate management and deployment. We needed to have some tweaks to the standard kind of containers, that Mojaloop containers that we deployed into Kubernetes, and kind of we coordinated with the foundation to get those updates done. So that was kind of reflected quite early on. Database as a service, so we're not deploying infrastructure as we're not deploying IaaS, but we're using database as a service, so that we get that great kind of high availability, clustering, scalability measure, but it's as a service rather than having to think about the scaling model across virtual machines or hardware. We built all of the deployment scripts, some tweaks to the Helm charts, and we ran against the test suite. So that was kind of a really good success. The one item that we wanted to do but didn't have time, and we found some issues around this, was the messaging subsystem that you're using in terms of Kafka. We have this capability in Azure called event hubs. And that's going to be a really, really low TCO, very cost optimized way of running high throughput event-driven architectures. And it has a Kafka interface, so it can talk the same language as Mojaloop's trying to talk. We found some issues around segmentation and the way that configuration was running. So we decided to park that one and stick with Kafka on VMs. We hope to revisit that at a later stage, because that would be a huge win from a TCO perspective in the cloud. In terms of Azure Stack, we got a full version of Mojaloop running on Azure Stack. In fact, we had it running on Azure Stack Hub in Rwanda with one of our partners who are running Azure Stack on-prem in country as part of a partnership that they have with us. That's Liquid Telecom. There are a couple of infrastructure prerequisites. So you've got a few kind of check boxes to hit before you hit the deploy button, but from that point on, it's a fully automated deployment into those environments on Azure Stack. So that was a really nice kind of success there. And the last thing that we actually managed to do was get Mojaloop available with a one-click deployment of the core services into Azure public cloud. And so basically, if you now log on to your Microsoft Azure portal and you hit create a new resource and you search for Mojaloop, you'll get this kind of one-click deploy. You fill in a few parameters about the configuration and deployment, hit the create button, and within, I would say, anywhere between 20 minutes and an hour, you've got a fully configured, testable, test-passing version of Mojaloop Hub in the cloud at what we think is a reasonably small configuration. That was a really kind of good outcome from that perspective. Again, I mean, this is really going to drive adoptability. You could have somebody who has a relatively limited set of cloud deployment skills can deploy this, and what you get at the end is the Mojaloop APIs presented in a way that are consumable by somebody who's wanting to kind of kick the tires on it. So what's next? We're hoping to initiate a phase 2 project. I've put the hand over to foundation, you know, technical assets, the marketplace assets. There are certain things which need to live in a cloud subscription for that Mojaloop Azure marketplace to be available. So we're kind of transitioning that across to the foundation, and Tom is helping us with that piece of work. It's not really phase 2, it's kind of end of phase 1, but we're kind of putting it in that phase. We deployed with the version that we had at the time we started the project. So the phase 2 needs to really bring us to the latest release revisions, reuse all of the technology, techniques, assets that we brought, and basically run a very rapid version of what we've already done to bring us to the latest version of Mojaloop. And I think what we really need to bake in here in very close collaboration with the foundation is, what does it look like to have ongoing updates maintained? So how do you keep the Azure Marketplace version up to date? What additional tweaks need to be made to either the scripts that we've written as part of the Azure deployment, or potentially to the Helm charts that can be leveraged, so that we can kind of really improve that ongoing version maintenance. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, our deployment and the proof point where we actually deployed to Rwanda was using Azure Stack Hub, which is a really, really kind of close match on-prem, but that's not commodity hardware. What we want to do is just effectively a refinement of what we've got on our Azure Stack current deployment to make it run very seamlessly on Azure Stack HCI. So this is where you get this kind of very broad geographic coverage. You get this really, really super easy scalability. It looks and feels like the cloud. And you also get to leverage things. We've got a product called Azure Arc, which effectively lets you even deploy services like AKS, like database as a service, like your monitoring stack, fully integrated with the public cloud. And really, really ease of adoption, ease of operational management, and driving down the TCO, because it looks, feels, and behaves very much like public cloud. We also want to drive a reference implementation that will include a couple of fake DFSPs. We're chatting to a few potential adopters, and we're also chatting to the folks in Africa and Enda. And one of the conclusions here is ease of adoption, where all you have is the engine in the middle, is not as easy for a non-technical audience to kind of grip. So in the same way that we've got the Azure Marketplace and scripted deployment into Azure, we want to do a version of that effectively bolts on two fully operating DFSPs, likely leveraging something like Fineract as the kind of two-sided model there. And then internally, I mean, one of the reasons that we were able to get funding to run this engineering project is we've got very significant sponsorship and support from senior executive management in Microsoft, and one of those organizations is the Office of the CTO. The reason that they were very interested is, once we get past this first stage and we're hooked into Azure, what we can look at is data and AI opportunities that would increase the capability of Mojaloop, leveraging some of our data and AI assets. So machine learning models around identifying the demographic balance of transactions, money flows, geographic assessment. So really doing some deep research around the data capabilities or kind of data insights and learning insights that you can get from the data flows that would be flowing through such a platform. So that's kind of one of the areas that we want to look at investing internally. But for the phase 2 remaining work, we're currently looking at what the funding model of that is going to be, and how we can go ahead and get that work done in the next 6 to 8 months if we can. So that's what phase 2 looks like. We hope to kick it off relatively soon. But we're still working through this kind of coordination and funding piece. And that's left an entire 4 minutes of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. A round of applause for him. Jason, can you still hear us?
Yeah, got you.
Awesome. We've just formatted so one question. Yes, Sam.
Thank you, Jason. This is amazing. I'm curious to know which version you're able to run now and what your experience is with running the tests. I know it was with the Postman test at the time of our testing toolkit test. Thank you.
Oh, gosh, what version? Is Greg on?
It's 13.1, Jason.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm not sure which version either. You'd have to get that from Dermatovich. I know he did a lot of Postman testing though.
Yeah.
Tom has the answer.
It's 13.1 and the Helm tests all pass.
Thanks, Tom.
Awesome. I'll allow just one more question. None. Thank you. Thanks so much, Jason.
Cool. Welcome.